Good morning, everybody. Today we shall be dealing with the Act 2 of All My Sons, written by Arthur Miller. Miller, 1915 to 2005, is an American playwright and essayist in the 20th century American theater. And All My Sons, that he has written in 1947, is one of his most popular and famous plays ever written in the history of playwright and drama. All My Sons is a play in three acts and is set in a small town several years after the World War II and begins with Jim Bayliss, a doctor, and Joe Keller, the head of the Keller family, sitting in Keller's backyard reading the newspaper. A storm the previous night has shown in half a tree that is revealed to memorize Larry Keller, one of the two children of Keller's, the son who did not survive the war. The entire story takes place in this backyard of the Keller house. It's a huge mansion. The Keller residence is a huge mansion and it has got a backyard with a beautiful garden. And in this garden, Act 1, 2, as well as 3 take place. As we discussed, Act 1 is related to the stage reductions describe that the Keller home as situated is an American suburb, roughly August 1947. The house is comfortable and well kept, as is the yard. Downstage left stands an apple tree. The trunk and branches are toppled beside it. Joe Keller is in his yard, reading the want ads. He is a self made businessman of about 60 years. Dr. Jim Bayliss, his neighbor, is about 40 years. He is reading the newspaper too, sitting by his side. Joe, his neighbor, Joe's neighbor on the other side is Frank, and Frank enters. Frank is around 32 years old. The neighbors chat about the weather and the want ads. Frank notices the felled tree. It was struck by lightning in the night, and he believes and observes how strange it is that the tree planted in the memory of Larry was struck down on his birth month. Larry is Joe's son. He would have been 27 this August, which Frank remembers because he's working on Larry's horoscope. What Frank is trying to figure out at the request of Kate, Joe's wife, is whether the day on which Larry was reported missing was his favorable day, when, astrologically speaking, odds are he wouldn't die. This piques skeptical Jim's interest. He doesn't buy it. Talk turns to Annie, a young woman who used to live next door. She is visiting the Kellers and is upstairs asleep for now. Jim makes a quip about how the block could use a pretty face. Just then, his fat wife arrives and nagging him about a patient's phone call. Frank's wife, Lydia, comes in, also curious about Annie. Is she engaged? She was Larry's betrothed, anyway. Chris Keller enters now. He's 32 years and he starts reading the book section. Joe and Chris start to talk about Larry's tree when 8-year-old neighbor Bert enters. He is Joe's deputy and tattles on some of other kids in the street. Asks to see the jail Joe keeps in his basement, but Joe won't allow him. Bert exits. Talk turns about the back to the tree. Mom saw it last night, says Chris. She was outside when it broke. Then she's come inside and cried a lot because it is symbolic of their lost brother. Kate Keller still believes Larry is coming back, even though it has been 3 years. Chris thinks they should puncture the illusion, but Joe wants to keep it intact. Chris sits next to his father and says, I'm going to propose to Annie, but mom still thinks that she is Larry's girl. Now, Chris wanted his father to help him in convincing his mother in this matter with Anne. Chris threatens to leave the town and also the family business if his father doesn't encourage his mother to support his marriage. Joe is very shocked to listen to Chris. Kate enters at this moment. She is a woman of 50 years and she's happy The tree blew down because it affirms for her that Larry is still alive. They were in a rush to memorialize him by planting the tree. Kate and Chris tiptoe around a discussion of Annie. Kate doesn't want to acknowledge that Chris might be quoting her. Kate recalls a dream she had about Larry last night. When she heard the wind, she imagined it was Larry flying by in his fighter plane. Kate turns to Joe and wags her finger at him. They shouldn't have planted the tree. They go up and give up. Too soon, she said. When Chris exits to get his mother an aspirin, she turns to Joe. Chris better not be planning to propose to Annie. Joe says he doesn't know anything at all about the issue, which is an outright lie because just in the previous scene, Chris tells Joe about his engagement with Anne. When Chris exits, Kate wants Joe to believe that with her that Larry will definitely come back. He asks her to calm down. They are again interrupted by Bert, who brings up the jail. Kate reacts very sharply, telling him that there is no jail inside their house. Now Anne enters from the house. She is beautiful and beautifully dressed. She has been living in New York. When Chris shows his admiration for Anne, Kate comments lightly that she has put on a little weight. Anne remarks on the little changes in the neighborhood, the trees, a missing hammock. She is introduced to Jim, who now lives in her old house in the same town. When Anne mentions Larry, Kate is relieved. Eventually, she asks Anne directly if she is waiting for Larry, for which Anne bluntly says no. Frank enters and dispels the tension. A little small talk, and then Frank mentions Anne's father. Anne's father actually is in prison. Anne is sensitive. She wants to know if the neighbors still talk about her father and his crime. Chris and Joe immediately say no to her. And Anne remembers the neighbors screaming murderers at her father, Steve, and also Joe. In a long monologue, Joe recalls the day he was cleared of the crime. He and Steve had been accused of selling cracked cylinder heads to the Air Force, causing 21 planes to crash. Joe was exonerated or pardoned on health grounds, but Anne's father was imprisoned on the charge. When Joe returned home, he walked down the street with a defiance and pride. He suggests the same for Steve when he is released. Anne admits that neither she nor her brother George keep in touch with their father anymore. They blame him for knowing shipping out faulty parts, resulting in the crash of fighter planes and the death of 21 American pilots. She wonders aloud whether this was responsible for Larry's death also. Listening to this, it really sets Kate off. Anne actually should never have said that. Joe Keller tells his version of the story. Joe himself was not keeping good health in those days. There was a mad rush for parts, and when the cylinders came out cracked, in the absence of Joe because of his poor health, cowardly, Steve just decided to send them out. He was afraid that Joe and the military would be displeased with the mistake, and so he just keeps quiet about it. Chris breaks in. He just wants a change of the subject, so they talk about the steak and champagne instead, and Joe Color exits. The long awaited proposal occurs when on the stage we could find only Chris and Anne. Chris proposes to Anne, and Anne immediately agrees for the marriage proposal. Now they just have to figure out how to tell Kate about their engagement. Chris has something to get off his chest. It's about the war, leading a company during the World War II, and he, having lost all the men, returned to the States and felt that nobody noticed. That the sacrifice of the men who died meant nothing actually substantial to the people at home. He has survivor's guilt, but Chris makes him feel very comfortable, as though he doesn't deserve life. But Chris feels very uncomfortable, as though he doesn't deserve life and doesn't deserve her. Whereas Anne sets him straight. He comforts him, she comforts him, and does deserve her, is the words that are uttered by Anne. And Joe interrupts them when they are talking very emotionally to each other, but as there was a phone call from George, Anne's brother, Joe becomes busy talking to him on phone. Chris tells Joe the news of his engagement to Anne. But Joe is preoccupied with the phone call. He's afraid George will want to open up his father's case again because he is also a lawyer, along with serving in the military or army. And so tells George that Anne is on his side. Anne emerges, and George is coming there to settle something. He wouldn't say that. Now, this rattles Joe as well as Kate. And in the last act, we saw as to Joe and Kate are very troubled with the news that George is going to visit them. Joe is much disturbed at George's news of arrival into the town. Kate tells Joe to be smart enough to overtake him. With this, the Act 1 ends. And then we enter into Act 2. It is the same evening and at twilight. The very change in afternoon to twilight or morning to twilight indicates the change in the mood of the entire story because the main part of the story takes place in the second act with the entry of George. And Chris is chopping down the rest of Larry's tree. Kate comes out and asks him to watch out for Joe. And um, when George arrives, she wanted the children to take care of Joe. She also wants him to ask Anne to leave with George. Chris still avoids telling his mother about their engagement. Anne comes out and has a brief exchange with Chris. She wanted them to tell Kate immediately. Sue emerges from her house next door. Over a glass of grape juice, she lets it all hang out for Anne. Number one, Anne should move elsewhere when she marries Chris. Number two, everyone on the block still thinks that Joe also is guilty, though he's released from the court of law. Anne gets totally freaked out. She asks Chris to assure her that Joe is innocent. He does. Joe comes out and, after some good old boy ribbing, tells Anne he would like to set George up with some of his local lawyer friends. He is trying to mend fences in the light of their marriage, he says. Then Joe ups the offer. He'll give Steve a job when he gets out of prison. Chris doesn't like the idea. Things set looks bad, but Joe believes they should forgive Steve and help set him up. Now Jim arrives. He has George in the car. The man who exactly is seen in the slide is George, talking in a very angry way. He warns Chris that George is angry and vengeful and plans to take Anne home. George enters. He is described as a man of about Chris's age, but pale and tweaked out. He is wearing a dirty shirt that shows that he has been traveling and has come here and has never bothered to change his dress. George meets Sue, who invites him to come over and see how they changed the house he lived in. He declines. He notices everything that is changed about the block. George has just been to visit his father, who is shrinking. He launches into why he came. Anne will not marry Chris, the son of the man who destroyed the entire family, says George. Filled with regret for turning his back on his father, George tells Steve's version of the broken cylinder story. In short, over an untraceable phone call, Joe told Steve to cover up the cracks and just send them out. So it is Joe who told Steve, and Steve did not take the decision independently. It's not a story Anne and Chris haven't heard. They have heard it in the court of law as well. George says that anyone who knows Steve and Joe knows the truth that Joe was guilty. It was only because Chris believes in Joe that George did, turning his back on his father. George is trying to take Anne away. Things get really heated. Then Kate comes out. This makes things hard for George because he really likes Kate. Kate mothers him, gives him juice, promises him to feed. George has to leave on the 8:30 train. Kate insinuates that he is taking Anne with him. And it's exactly here that Lydia comes out. She and George used to have a thing. Actually, Lydia was George's girlfriend. He is sad that she's sacked up with Frank and has three babies now. Kate says she told him so. Now she wants him to move back, get a job through Joe, and find a girl. Joe enters. Some awkward small talk goes on between them, and Acting very friendly, Joe brings up another instance in which Steve failed to gracefully take the blame and has called a cab. But Joe invites George to stay for dinner. He is just happily accepting when Kate makes a slip. She says Joe hasn't been sick in the last 15 years. Now, this part of the story is very interesting and important. Kate says that um, Joe hasn't been sick in the last 15 years. But linchpin of Joe's story was that the flu laid him up on that fateful day, which is why Steve is not in the jail and has been released. George doesn't let Kate's slip pass. He is on the attack. Frank comes in with the horoscope. It implies Larry is alive. This is just what Kate wants to hear. George is leaving, and Kate openly directs Anne to go with him. She even packed her bag. Chris is furious. He tells George to go. Anne doesn't. Anne does too, but she exits to see him off. Finally, Chris tells his mother that he plans to marry Anne. Kate straightaway refuses to accept that. For her, Larry is still alive. Larry is alive because if he is dead, his own father killed him. Now it is outrightly understood. So everything comes out very plainly in Act 2, and Act 2 is the climax, where people start understanding that, yes, it is the father who is the guilty. Chris is totally flawed. His father is guilty. It cannot be acceptable for Chris at all. Though George has blamed that Chris's father is responsible for the crash of 21 planes and is also directly and indirectly is responsible for Steve's imprisonment. Still, Chris cannot accept that his father is guilty of killing 21 uh, pilots and crashing 21 fighter planes for the American Army. Joe tries to explain himself. He's a man of business. Ultimately, he comes out with his point that yes, he was guilty and he has used the wrong stuff in the American fighter plane engines. But what else could he do? He was building a business for his sons after all. Now Chris attacks him, calling him lower than an animal. And now Chris is completely depressed. Thank you very much for having a patient listening for Act 2, which is very interesting and very important in the entire drama of All My Sons. Bye for now and wait for the third